The committee will please come to order. Quorum is present. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider H.R. 6914, the Pregnant Students' Rights Act, and H.R. 443, the Enhancing Detection of Human Trafficking Act. The chair announces that requests for recorded votes as to amendments may be postponed pursuant to Clause 2 of Rule 11 of the Rules of the House of Representatives and Committee Rule 14B. Without objection, the chair may recess the committee at any point. Welcome to today's markup, in which we'll be considering two important pieces of legislation. The first bill, Representative Ashley Henson's Pregnant Students' Rights Act, is a bill that would require universities to disclose the protections and rights entitled to pregnant students on college campuses. For pregnant students, the path through college is already a complex one that can be compounded by the responsibility of impending motherhood. Physically and emotionally, every decision becomes a little more challenging. The goal with any decision during this deeply personal and sensitive time should be to maximize the pregnant mother's educational journey while minimizing harm done to her child's potential future. As for universities, it is their role to foster an environment of support and understanding where pregnant students feel safe, seeking guidance and assistance. Too often, though, counselors fail to provide pregnant students with a complete picture of all the resources available to them. Therefore, the Pregnant Students' Rights Act ensures that universities are not withholding resources and information about carrying the baby to term from pregnant students, such as students' potential right to modify class schedules for doctor visits. Also, the bill will inform students of their recourse to potential rights violations by filing a Title IX complaint with the Department of Education. Simply, this bill operates on the assumption that pregnant women, especially those facing the daunting uncertainty of an unexpected college pregnancy, should know all options available to them to help carry the baby to term. For this reason alone, the Pregnant Students' Rights Act deserves the committee's full support. Next on the agenda is a bipartisan bill sponsored by Representatives Wahlberg and Sablon, titled the Enhancing Detection of Human Trafficking Act. This bill would provide additional tools to combat one of the greatest challenges of our time, human trafficking. According to the International Labor Organization, around 27.6 million victims were trafficked on any given day in 2022. These horrific crimes have been exacerbated due to the open border policies of the Biden administration and the emboldening of the drug cartels, who make millions of dollars trafficking individuals and enslaving innocent boys and girls. That's why the Enhancing Detection of Human Trafficking Act puts the full force of the federal government in action to combat human trafficking, which too often occurs close to home. This bipartisan bill ensures that Department of Labor enforcement personnel receive the proper education to detect instances of human trafficking so that law enforcement agencies can quickly get involved, and so that justice can be swift. Members have worked hard to get these two bills before the committee today, and they focus on helping protect vulnerable adults and children in workplaces and in post-secondary education. With that, I thank the sponsors for their hard work and look forward to the passage of these bills. I now yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, the committee is marking up two bills. The first bill we will consider is H.R. 6914, the so-called Pregnant Students' Rights Act. More than a year and a half ago, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which triggered state-sanctioned abortion bans and imposed a complicated web of legal challenges for reproductive health providers and patients seeking care. Now the House Republicans want to limit students' access to information about resources, including all accommodations and protections available to pregnant students and student parents on college campuses. Although this bill purports to educate pregnant students about their academic rights and protections, its impact is much more sinister. By requiring institutions of higher education to only share information that encourages students to carry a pregnancy to term, They are potentially unduly influencing a woman's choice by keeping her in the dark about all options available to her. Moreover, they fail to support or even acknowledge the students who have different pregnancy-related outcomes, including those who may experience a miscarriage. Women should be able to control their own bodies, lives, and futures. By shielding students about health care choices, resources, and rights that are available to them, we are denying them the choice to decide what is best for themselves and their families. Somewhat ironically, we're also, as we're marking up this bill, the Republicans on the Appropriations Committee are pushing sweeping cuts to services and programs that student parents would benefit from, such as on-campus child care centers and fully funding WIC nutrition programs. Today, excuse me. Today, the committee Democrats will focus on offering amendments to ensure students have access to comprehensive and accurate reproductive health care education, including information about contraception, abortion, pregnancy loss, and a full suite of services available to them during their pregnancy and after birth. In a post-Roe world, it is more important now than ever that people have access to comprehensive and accurate reproductive health care information. So I'll be opposing this legislation and urge my colleagues to do the same. Second bill is a non-controversial bipartisan measure led by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, and the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablon, that ensures the Department of Labor continues to train and educate employees on detecting and appropriately reporting cases of suspected human trafficking. Exploiting our most vulnerable workers has no place in our society, but regrettably, far too many people continue to be forced to work in abusive, unsafe, and unlawful working conditions at the hands of criminals and unscrupulous employers. To be clear, I support the bipartisan legislation, but committee Republicans should not be taking a victory lap as they are doing everything possible to address, as if they were doing everything possible to address trafficking, which they are not. House Republicans continue to advance budgets that defund the Bureau of International Labor Affairs, ILAB, which includes the Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking. In case this was not evident to my colleagues, the very office that plays a pivotal role in cracking down on human trafficking and the use of child labor in global supply chains is ILAB, and the one that is being defunded. This bill does not even authorize additional funding for the Department of Labor to conduct the training or complete the required report, which are parts of the legislation. Now, according to the Department of Labor, child labor violations have quintupled since 2015, but committee Republicans have refused our repeated requests to schedule a hearing focused on child labor. Meanwhile, Republican state legislators all over the country continue to roll back child labor protections. If my Republican colleagues are serious about ending child labor, I urge them to consider the Protecting Children Act, which Ranking Member Adams and I introduced last July. The Protecting Children Act would empower the Department of Labor to address child labor by providing federal worker protection agencies with the tools and resources to deter violations that prevent harm to children from intensive work in dangerous jobs. So thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written opening statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day today. House rules require that a copy of the measure be made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance pursuant to the notice for today's meeting. A copy of the measures were made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. The bills being marked up today shall be open to amendment at any point, and the chair will allow members to offer amendments in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Without objection, members who have more than one amendment to a bill and wish to offer their amendments en bloc may do so. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the bill H.R. 6914 for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6914, a bill to require institutions of higher education to disseminate information on the rights of and accommodations and resources for pregnant students and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. Ms. Miller, I understand that you may have an amendment.
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk, Amendment Miller _ANS_01.
The clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6914 offered by Mrs. Miller of Illinois, identifier ANS_01.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text for purposes of further amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed. I now recognize Representative Miller for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you. I am pleased to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute for H.R. 6914, the Pregnant Students' Rights Act. Navigating college is undoubtedly challenging with the demands of coursework and the whirlwind of personal growth. However, amidst these difficulties, the beauty of bringing new life into the world should not be overshadowed. Pregnant students deserve to embark on this wonderful journey with the assurance that they will not have to navigate this alone. We owe it to our daughters to provide them with necessary knowledge and support to thrive during pregnancy. Unfortunately, many pregnant women are unaware of their basic rights on campus. Universities often fall short in offering clear information about the available support systems and resources tailored to assist them in their academic pursuits. It is crucial to highlight that pregnant women can have access to modified class schedules and excused absences and accommodations for doctor visits. The false notion that these women must choose between their health, their baby's well-being, and academic success needs to be debunked. Counselors often perpetuate the false binary that a student on campus has to either choose between abortion or dropping out, while failing to present the third and best option, envisioning a path where a student can complete her education while carrying her baby to term. That's why the committee is considering H.R. 6914, a bill that advocates for transparency. This bill aims to require universities to disclose information regarding accommodations and protections available to pregnant students. At the heart of this legislation are two goals. We aspire to foster a campus culture that prizes both the education of its female students and the sanctity of life. I see these goals as pro-women, pro-education, and pro-life. With that, let's focus on building a future where a pregnant student can feel supported, informed, and empowered to continue her education while embracing the beautiful journey of bringing a child into the world. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll move to the last word. Madam Chair, this committee is tasked with some of the most important legislative work in Congress, particularly when it comes to meeting the needs of parents or those who want to become parents. When it's faced, this bill may appear to ensure students are informed of available resources and the ways students can continue to access their education while pregnant, but in fact, it is an attempt to dissuade students from considering or utilizing abortion services and make it more difficult for students to receive full and accurate information on their rights, including rights that are already protected under Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. This is why dozens of health and reproductive rights organizations, such as the National Women's Law Center, the National Partnership for Women and Families, and the American Civil Liberties Union, have asserted that the bill, quote, falls far short of the protections that are actually necessary for pregnant and parenting students and their children. The letter further states that the bill is a thinly veiled anti-abortion in nature and that it would not address key barriers to pregnant students' educational attainment and instead would further shame and stigmatize people for their pregnancy outcomes. Madam Chair, in fact, the ANS goes even further than the original text by further narrowing the scope of the information provided to students and students to which it's provided. It only provides information to students about carrying a child to term and caring for the child after birth. This further isolates students who may seek an abortion or those who suffer a miscarriage or stillbirth. Further, the ANS makes it clear that the bill should not be interpreted to authorize the requirement to distribute information beyond what's in the bill. It's worth noting that Title IX, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in education programs or activities that receive federal funding, and it forbids discriminating against students on the basis of a student's pregnancy, childbirth, false pregnancy, termination of pregnancy, or recovery therefrom. These requirements ensure that students are not denied or otherwise limited access to educational programs or activities based on their pregnancy or related medical conditions. This includes the range of pregnancy-related conditions, including abortion and miscarriage. This bill does not alter or change an institution's responsibility under Title IX. Rather, it cherry-picks certain information to share with certain students. Committee Democrats remain committed to ensuring that all students, including those who choose to become parents, are set up for educational success, and much more needs to be done to support the financial security of our nation's students. We've introduced numerous pieces of legislation that would better support parents, including students who are parents, such as through expansion of affordable child care, raising the federal minimum wage to provide family-sustaining pay, and others. And troubling, the bill does not provide any additional resources or grant any additional rights to pregnant or parenting students, leaving those the bill purports to help with the same inadequate resources, such as unaffordable child care, as without the bill. Anti-choice efforts, such as those underpinning the bill, only make it harder for students to succeed, and many students are experiencing new and added stress when navigating their health and access to health care. This bill and the ANS are simply not an earnest attempt to support students. There's a lot more that we can do to support students, but this doesn't do it. We continue to fight for abortion rights and reproductive autonomy. We must ensure that students are fully informed of all options regarding their reproductive health care and wellness. So I oppose the amendment as well as the underlying bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Anyone else wish to be recognized? Ms. McBath, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Chairwoman Fox, thank you very, very much. I move to strike the last word. And thank you, Ranking Member Scott, as well, and to your staff for hosting today's markup. Today's bill, the Pregnant Students' Rights Act, is unfortunately not a bill about protecting pregnant and parenting students or improving outcomes at all. As written, this legislation is just another thinly veiled attempt to further roll back the rights of women in our country and unduly pressure students into making serious health decisions, deeply personal health decisions that are best left to women, their families, and their doctors, and not to us, the politicians. Instead, we could be spending this time here today considering legislation that will actually support pregnant and parenting students. Instead of trying to score political points, I encourage my colleagues to consider legislation like mine to study the issue and determine why it is that parenting college students are less likely to graduate despite earning higher GPAs than students without children. We should not leverage the very real needs of students and their children against the highly polarizing and personal topics of reproductive rights and abortion. In November, I introduced the Understanding Student Parent Outcomes Act of 2023 with my friend and colleague from North Carolina, Deborah Ross. It would help us identify and establish best practices to improve graduation rates and to help pregnant and parenting Americans to stay in school. Practices like ensuring access to quality on-campus childcare, accommodations for breastfeeding, and increased accountability when schools fail to provide these things. Supporting pregnant and parenting students should be a bipartisan effort, but it can't be when this bill our colleagues brought today is written in such a way that it has more to do with pushing an ideological stance on abortion than assisting the students that it claims to. I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure that the more than 5.4 million students who are parenting while in school are given the support that they need to finish their degree, improve their career and family, and move into that higher income level that they've been dreaming of and working so hard towards. I would like to submit a letter from the Coalition for Pregnant and Parenting Students Advocacy expressing their deep concern about the consequences of my colleague's bill and its failure to truly address the needs of students. I wholeheartedly encourage all of my colleagues to oppose the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. McBath. I'd like the members to know I am recognizing you in the order I was given by the Minority Council. Ms. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Today, I rise in opposition to the Pregnant Student Rights Act. Under this legislation, institutions of higher education would be required to disseminate information to prospective and current students on their rights during pregnancy. The rhetoric around this bill is that women in college face pressures to abort their child by these institutions that simply is unfounded. This is nothing more than an attack on the rights of women to control their own body and to seek an abortion if they choose. The late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Ginsburg said it best. A woman's right to choose is something central to a woman's life and to her dignity. When the government controls that decision for her, she's being treated as less than a full adult human being responsible for her own choices. As a mother and a grandmother, I am appalled that we live in a day and an age where members of Congress sit down and decide that a woman shouldn't be educated or provided the necessary resources to make personal medical decisions, including terminating a pregnancy. As a former professor at Bennett College in North Carolina and a women's college, I'm disappointed that what's top of mind for the majority of members of this Congress is what they do with their bodies, what women will do with their bodies. College is a very busy and delicate time for any student with extremely consequential decisions for their futures to make nearly every day. Classes, clubs, papers, and projects. We set them loose, task them with making the biggest decisions of their lives, and we tell them that they are adults, who we are able to decide that they shouldn't or should have an abortion. I've seen firsthand the impacts that pregnancies and parenting can have on students. Regardless of your personal feelings about abortion, they have and deserve the right to all available resources. Every year, more than 2 women between 18 and 24 become pregnant, and statistics show that 26% of undergraduate students are raising children today. Many of these same students struggled with access to other reproductive care, including contraception and safe maternal health care services. Many college students nationwide lack access to a full range of contraceptives on campus. Policy measures such as enhancing reproductive health services at student health centers or increasing contraception availability directly through pharmacies will improve access for college students and actually reduce the number seeking abortion. Requiring that all information be provided except abortion services denies students their reproductive autonomy and can have negative consequences if they are unable to access the abortion care they need, according to a study by Turnaround. These are the conversations that we need to have. Since becoming a member of Congress, I have dedicated myself to protecting the rights of women, and that's why, as co-chair of the Black Maternal Health Caucus, I've worked to maintain bodily autonomy for Americans and to educate women on their options. They deserve the ability to choose. Research has shown that when abortion is banned or restricted, the number of abortions does not decrease. Abortions just move underground. You know, this increases the risk both of unsafe procedures and that people will be reported to police or prosecuted for suspected abortions. The rate of unsafe abortions is nearly 45 times higher in countries with highly restrictive abortion laws than in countries where abortion is legal and unrestricted, according to Human Rights Watch. Access to true reproductive care is fundamentally linked to protecting and upholding human rights. I applaud the efforts of the Biden administration and the Department of Education for their work on addressing these issues. The department, specifically the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which my Republican colleagues have attempted to defund. After the Dobbs decision, the department issues guidance to students and schools to reinforce protections for pregnancy and related medical conditions. This bill is just another attempt to attack the rights of our students. They're provided with resources on sex education, contraceptive, and their options, whether that's abortion, parenting, or adoption. So as members, we should protect and fulfill human rights, including those concerning sexual and reproductive health and autonomy. This bill is anti-choice, it's anti-student, it's anti-people, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on this legislation. I yield back my time, Madam Chair.
Ms. Bonamici, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word and speak in opposition to the amendment in the nature of the substitute and the
You're
underlying bill.
recognized for 5 minutes.
This legislation requires institutions of higher education to distribute information about some of the rights of and accommodations for pregnant students. I oppose this bill because, among other reasons, what is required is incomplete and biased because it does not provide information about comprehensive family planning resources and a full range of reproductive health care options for pregnant students. The bill requires that students get information about the protection they have against discrimination and a right to accommodation if they are pregnant while enrolled in an institute of higher education. But obviously, whether and when to have a child is a decision with lifelong consequences. If my colleagues want to encourage pregnancy and childbirth, I have some suggestions. Join us in making childcare affordable. Join us in supporting access to affordable health care and affordable housing. Expand the Children's Health Insurance Program. If you want to support pregnancies, then let's join the rest of the world in offering paid family leave. Work with us to close the maternal mortality rate, which is alarmingly high and actually rising in this country, especially for women of color. Shouldn't we tell pregnant students about that too? And I'll note that my colleague said when she introduced the ANS that she talked about what we owe to our daughters. Well, think about this, parents of sons. What if the person who impregnated the student is also a student? Shouldn't they get information about paternity responsibility and child support obligations? And my colleague also said the best option is for the student is to carry the pregnancy to term. Well, that might be true for some, but it certainly isn't for others, and it is not the decision of a member of Congress to make that choice for the student. Every pregnancy is different, and that's why the pregnant student should be making the decision about what is the best option for them. Finally, this bill threatens a loss of federal Title IV funding under the Higher Education Act, which would affect an entire student population. That's making low-income students pay for this bad policy. That's neither warranted nor fair. The intent of this bill is clear. It's another attempt to have politicians interfere in the intensely personal decision of whether and when to have a child, a decision that should be made only by the pregnant student and their healthcare provider, not by judges, and certainly not by members of Congress. So instead of working on partisan legislation that fails to address the full healthcare needs of students and served as a veiled attempt to further an anti-abortion agenda, we should be working together to protect students' bodily autonomy and respect them when they are faced with these deeply personal healthcare decisions. I encourage all of my colleagues to oppose the amendment in the nature of the substitute in the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Hayes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I've shared many times on this committee and with my constituents that I was a teenage mom. I was, in fact, a pregnant and a parenting student. So I know firsthand the difficulties of navigating the education system while pregnant or having small children. Title IX already prohibits discrimination based on sex, including pregnancy and parental status, in educational programs and activities. Many adults may feel continuing their higher education journey is not compatible with with parenthood. I agree with the underlying premise of the Pregnant Students' Rights Act. Institutions of higher education should have to distribute information about the rights of pregnant students and the resources available to them at the school through their website, student handbooks, emails, and during student orientations. Additionally, the bill reinforces current laws requiring schools to adopt and publish procedures for students to file complaints of discrimination related to their sex, pregnancy, or parental status. Unfortunately, this bill falls short of addressing the full scope of the needs of students. For example, it does not require institutions of higher education to provide comprehensive sexual and reproductive health information, including information on how to access contraception or abortion services. Additionally, Section 2 of the legislation generalizes academic disparities for pregnant people without citation. But ultimately, there is no place for discrimination on college campuses, and all people should have access to higher education. In this spirit, I plan to support this legislation because I don't want other young parents, I don't want other pregnant students to have to experience many of the obstacles that I had to overcome all by myself. But I would ask my Republican colleagues, if you truly care about helping pregnant and parenting students, if you truly want to work on legislation that will help them, I have a piece that I introduced that I'd like you to consider. The Preparing and Resourcing Our Student Parents and Early Childhood Teacher Act, or the Prospect Act, which aims to improve access to affordable, quality infant and toddler child care for student parents. So not just birth, but supporting children through life. My bill invests in community college and minority-serving institutions to become incubators for infant and child care talent, training, and access on their campus. The Prospect Act provides free, high-quality infant and toddler child care to student parents at guarantee institutions. If you really want to support our student parents, we would work on much of the legislation that my colleague, Ms. Bonamici, just described. We would put in place the child tax credit. We would make sure that the parents who do choose to have their children have all of the supports that are necessary for them to thrive and for their children to thrive. That's what you would do if you truly cared about the health and well-being of pregnant and parenting students. We must address the healthcare crisis in our nation. We must address the child care crisis in our nation. We must continue to work to support people who choose to have their children. This bill is a thinly veiled attempt to pass anti-choice legislation. I recognize that, but I also am fully aware that any information that we can give to students to help them make the best possible choices for themselves and their future is something that I can support. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Hayes. Ms. Manning, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am deeply disappointed that in today's markup, the majority has chosen to discuss, alongside a more reasonable bipartisan bill, a grossly partisan attack on reproductive rights. On its surface, this legislation is being sold as an effort to protect the rights of pregnant students. This is an incredibly important issue, and there may be college-age women who become pregnant or who choose to become pregnant and carry their pregnancies to term who require different resources than their peers. There may be women at institutions of higher education who are pursuing an undergraduate degree later in life, and there may be women pursuing graduate degrees while pregnant. And I'm sure I speak for all of my colleagues when I say that we want to support them all. But this bill doesn't offer real support to these women, and it doesn't offer funding to help universities provide support to pregnant women or to help those women bear the cost of raising a child while in school. Why? Because this bill is not about protecting pregnant women at all. Instead, this bill's findings are a thinly veiled attack on abortion. Rather than presenting any actual evidence of a problem that requires governmental intervention, this bill makes the unsubstantiated claim that a female student may face pressure to receive an abortion. This bill doesn't direct funds toward ensuring that institutions of higher education have affordable childcare, or an obstetrician who can guide a woman through her pregnancy, or a pediatrician who can help that woman navigate the difficulties of raising a baby while being a student. It doesn't ensure that these institutions have housing for students that is suitable for a child. It certainly doesn't discuss what a young woman should do if she doesn't want to become pregnant, despite the fact that experts report a lack of accurate knowledge about contraception among young people. The bill doesn't even direct the Secretary of Education to investigate the institutional reprisal of pregnant students that the bill describes in its own findings. The pregnant women in the so-called Pregnant Students' Rights Act are actually an afterthought. Those of us on this side of the aisle would love to work on bills protecting pregnant students and pregnant workers. In fact, we did so when we had the majority. We passed the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. It is deeply disappointing to me that rather than work on a serious bipartisan bill that would actually solve the problems pregnant students might face on campus, some of my colleagues would prefer to use this time to demonize those women who choose to have abortions. And one more thing. I'm the mother of 2 daughters. If I had learned after I sent my daughters off to college that those colleges were advising my daughters about what they should do if they had become pregnant, I would have been furious. If I had learned that some administrator at a college was encouraging my daughter to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term, telling her about supposed support systems and creating a stigma against having an abortion and preventing her from making her own decision about when, whether, and with whom to have a child, a decision that would have impacted the rest of her life, I would have been appalled. I find this one-sided attempt to influence young people on their reproductive choices to be government overreach in the extreme, and I urge my colleagues to vote no. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. There being no further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Ms. Bonamici, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I seek recognition because I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6914, offered by Ms. Bonamici of Oregon, identifier AMD_01.
The gentlewoman from Oregon is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Pregnant Students' Rights Act, as we discussed, cherry picks the information it requires to be shared with students and the students it chooses to support. The bill fails to support any students with pregnancy outcomes other than carrying to term, including those who decide to terminate a pregnancy. By focusing requirements under this bill on support for students who carry a pregnancy to term, the bill excludes abortion-related information, including the fact that students who have abortions are protected from discrimination under Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, and this is by design. My amendment makes clear that nothing in this bill prevents schools from providing students with medically accurate and comprehensive information about abortion services. Since 1975, regulations implementing Title IX have expressly prohibited discrimination against students on the basis of pregnancy and pregnancy-related conditions, which includes termination of a pregnancy. Under Title IX, schools must provide students who have abortions with access to leave for medical appointment and recovery. Furthermore, it prohibits harassment by other students or school employees related to a student's pregnancy conditions, including a choice to terminate a pregnancy. And importantly, it requires schools to provide accommodations for missed work or projects because of absences because of pregnancy-related conditions, which I have just explained includes a full range of pregnancy-related conditions. Providing students with medically accurate and comprehensive information about abortion services, including the protections, accommodations, and other resources available to them under the law, directly supports the health and well-being of these students. Unfortunately, anti-choice efforts such as those underpinning this bill make it harder for students to make their own healthcare decisions. For example, post-Dobbs, many students are experiencing new and added stress when navigating their health and access to health care, including abortion care, because many states have tried to prohibit healthcare providers and health plans from offering or covering certain reproductive health care services. This makes reproductive health care prohibitively expensive for millions of students and has limited access to contraception and other preventive services, as well as limiting the availability of providers. These anti-abortion efforts have disproportionately affected students whose access to services and information is limited by geographical barriers unique to their institutions. For example, approximately 80% of historically black colleges and universities are located in states that have passed restrictions or bans on abortion care, pushing services further out of reach for hundreds of thousands of students. Where states are restricting access to abortion services, students are traveling out of state for abortions. And that's because, as centuries of history have shown us, and as my colleague Representative Adams noted in her remarks, when abortion is restricted, it doesn't go away. It becomes more expensive and often more dangerous. Students deserve access to medically accurate and comprehensive information about abortion services, and they shouldn't have to travel or pay a fortune to get it. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment offered by Ms. Bonamici? If not, the question on the amendment is on the amendment by the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. A roll call vote is ordered. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek to be recognized?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6914 offered by Mr. Good of Virginia, identifier Good_125.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment adds important information to the findings section of the bill to explain how women can be negatively impacted if they lack support for motherhood and are pressured into getting an abortion. It's hard being a student. It's hard being a parent. Combining the two and adding the difficulties of single parenting, often with limited money or resources, and pregnancy can be overwhelming. Mothers in challenging situations deserve our compassion, support, and encouragement. But sadly, mothers enrolled in colleges and universities are up against a pro-death abortion industry that wants to exploit them and their unborn children. Cultural pressures promote a false choice that a woman must prioritize career over family. The abortion industry wants to force mothers to decide between killing their child or achieving academic success. The truth is, there has never been a better time in history to be a career woman and a devoted mother. There are laws that protect pregnant women from being discriminated against, flexible job options that work better for families, far more access to maternity leave, and abundant resources at pregnancy support centers to help women during pregnancy and after delivery. But the truth is that abortion is harmful to babies and to women. As my amendment explains, women who receive abortions are 34% more likely to develop anxiety disorders, 37% more likely to develop depression, 110% more likely to use or abuse alcohol, 115% more likely to develop suicidal behavior, and 220% more likely to use marijuana. The pro-life position of supporting mothers in school is a win-win. When we support the mother's ability to finish her degree, we are investing in the American dream for the next generation. I believe my amendment strengthens the text by underscoring how important it is for mother and baby to be supported and to support a mother carrying her baby to full term. I hope my colleagues will vote in favor of my amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
First, Madam Chair, I've heard a couple of times that it set up a false choice that you either have to get an abortion or complete your studies. That is something that's made up on the Republican side and not anything that's suggested on this side. If the students want to complete their education, it would be helpful to get real services, not just misinformation. But this amendment claims to highlight the harms that abortion causes women. However, does not mention that, according to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, being denied an abortion leads to more anxiety than receiving an abortion. There are also those that indicate abortions are safe medical interventions. ACOG says that the majority of abortions are performed in outpatient, non-hospital settings. Complications from abortions are extremely rare. And in those few occasions where complication does occur, the complications are minor and easily treatable with follow-up procedures or antibiotics. ACOG also disproved the myth that those receiving abortions are more likely to get breast cancer. They said there is no causal link between breast cancer and abortion. So I think we need to deal with some of the misinformation. Reality is the bill does nothing. Excuse me. Reality is the bill does nothing to enhance pregnant students' rights to provide them with the child care, the housing, and nutrition support they need to help them complete their education. Instead, the bill is another attempt by House Republicans to stop women from learning about all options that may be available to them, including abortion and contraception. For that reason, I urge a no vote on the amendment. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Chavez DeRemer, seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's true that abortion sometimes is presented as the only choice.
The gentlewoman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Pardon me. Thank you. It's true that abortion sometimes is presented as the only choice for unplanned pregnancies, adding to the trapped feeling which hits the moment a young woman's test reads positive when they were praying desperately for negative. The bill we're considering today is about lifting at least some of the weight those women bear, requiring their universities to provide information about resources for carrying a pregnancy to term. Pregnancy is beautiful but grueling, and doing it without a plan or alone adds a sense of defeat more intense than can be put into words. Students having access to resources for their pregnancies isn't just about abortion. It means telling students which obstetricians, gynecologists their insurance covers, or how to navigate things if they're uninsured. It means finding a pediatrician before your child is born for those early visits. It means being shown how to get on wait lists for child care centers. It means information about your degree process or NC2A eligibility if you choose to take time away from school. This amendment being offered by Congressman Good brushes aside those realities and countless others by turning this into something only about abortion. It ignores the full picture. This is about options and support for students not going through the most, This is about options and support for students going through the most unsure moment in their young life. It is not about Congress lecturing women. In its current form, I think this bill has a good shot of becoming law. And should that happen, it will result in countless women never setting foot in an abortion clinic with a newfound confidence to keep their pregnancy and be a mom. I'll be voting no on this amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Stevens, seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a comment about the amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I'm striking the last word.
The gentlewoman's recognized for 5
On
minutes.
amendments. Well, Madam Chair, finding out last night that we were marking up the Pregnant Student Rights Act, I have found it very interesting here in the United States Congress that colleagues from the other side of the aisle are talking about pregnant women's rights. I'd love to talk about that, and I'd love to talk about it from the standpoint of what type of care pregnant women will receive. And if narrowly we want to talk about it from the angle of students, let's talk about how we protect women who have complications with their pregnancy. Are they able to receive the care that they need? My colleague from Virginia, Mr. Good, has introduced an amendment about the impact of abortion on women's health. Yes, let's talk about the impact of pregnancy complications on women. What happens in moments when you are bleeding out, when your baby might not be able to be conceived. What type of care are you getting? What type of care are Black women in this country getting? Have we added an amendment for that when we have the highest rates of Black maternal mortality in the industrialized world, increasing mortality for women in the wake of, quote, abortion bans? Where and how do women get access to care? If you are a pregnant student, what are your rights to travel? What if you want to go to the college football game out of state? Are you going to have to take an oath that you are not going to seek to get proper care given how strict and oppressive healthcare access has become in this country for women? Let's have this conversation. Let's talk about the rights of pregnant women and their access to care, their access to good medical care, and doctors who are going to give them the proper information that will protect their lives, that will protect the life, certainly, of their child that they willfully want to conceive in their body, their choice. Yes, as their brain is still forming and they're making their way through access to higher education. I'd love to make these investments in proper health care for women. Because at every turn, when you look at the NIH and you look at the studies on heart attacks, on ovarian cancer, on endometriosis, on adenomyosis, on thyroid, my goodness gracious, even women in the vehicles. We don't have the crash test dummies based off of women. We don't invest in the studies. We don't have enough information on it. That's what they say. So sure, let's talk about the impacts of lack of proper health care for women and what that does. I'm voting no on all of this, obviously, because it doesn't work for women. It belies the truth. It fear-mongers, and it doesn't lead to good outcomes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition? I'm sorry, Mr. Burgess, I did not see you.
I'd like to yield my
For
time
what
to
purpose does Mr. Burgess seek recognition? You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to yield my time, Mr. Good.
To Mr. Good.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. You know, I disagree with the idea that not having access to an abortion harms a woman's health. Abortion always harms the baby's health. The other side never talks about how abortion ends a life because that's an inconvenient truth for them. Further, the idea that women can only be happy and successful if they have access to abortion is such a small view of women and of the world at large. President Ronald Reagan once said, "I've noticed that everyone who is in favor of abortion has already been born." Creating life is a miracle and motherhood is a blessing. Overcoming adversity makes the triumph that much greater. Human rights are based on the truth that every life has dignity because everyone is created in the image of God. Of course, women also have access to adoption, which is such a very brave and noble thing to do. And I've often said there's nothing more Christ-like that we can do than to adopt. Resources exist to help women in challenging times. And when a woman has support, raising a child will enrich her life beyond what she could imagine. This bill is about connecting women to life-saving resources. And my amendment underscores the importance of that mission. Furthermore, my amendment simply adds data into the findings section about the risks of abortion for mothers. Abortion does more than just harm the child, it leaves a mark on the mother. As my amendment cites, 60% of women having an abortion experience some level of emotional distress afterwards. And my amendment emphasizes that resources mentioned in the underlying bill are of the utmost importance, not only for the sake of the child, but also for the well-being of the mother. As the party that stands for life, we must be bold and not hide from the fact that abortion has two victims, the mother and the baby. So I urge my colleagues to support the inclusion of this data in the bill, and I yield back.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Utah yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I speak and rise to oppose the amendment offered by my colleague from Virginia, Mr. Good. As I stated previously, I support the idea of providing students with the information and access about choices in a pregnancy. But this amendment does exactly what many of my Democratic colleagues fear. It turns this legislation into partisan anti-abortion legislation. This is not about providing students with access. I chose to be a student. I chose to continue my education, but that might not be the choice for someone else. And they should be given all of the information and be able to make that choice based on the facts. It is very interesting that my colleague, Mr. Good, talks about quoting, President Reagan and other men. And what I would offer is that if any of those men chose not to have an abortion, I would support them. Because it is ultimately the woman's right to choose. It is the right of the person who has to make that decision, free from government interference, free from members of Congress deciding, free from people in this body and on this committee telling them what is best for them. So if we truly want to support the rights of our constituents and the rights of Americans, let people make their own decisions. Let them look at their own experiences. Let them look at their own life and say, what is best for me? And make sure that they have all the information to do that. This legislation does not do that. And what I really tried to view as a good faith effort to make small steps and on this issue, what I really tried to sit with and say, while I don't agree with every part of this legislation, the idea that students should be given information is not a bad idea. This makes it very difficult because it's going down a rabbit hole of making this about pro-birth, of making this about checking off a box on a very extreme agenda to force women to have children that they may or not be ready for. What we need to do is support our pregnant and parenting students and provide them with all of the options and not force them into, I think the word was the Christian thing to do. Well, that doesn't work for everybody. That's not everybody's choice. That's not the way everybody makes their decisions, and it's not up to this Congress to decide that and make those decisions for people. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I'm trying really, really hard to continue to support the overall bill and move in good faith to say, well, it is a step towards providing information, but these amendments in nature of a substitute are making it really hard to do that. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. For what purpose does Mr. Wahlberg seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield time to Mr. Good from Virginia.
Mr. Good's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg and Madam Chair. You know, since someone on the other side mentioned the racial disparity and the impact of abortion, I certainly agree with that. Abortion disproportionately affects minority communities. Black babies are 3.4 times more likely to be aborted than white babies in this country. An estimated 19 million black babies have been killed by abortion since 1973. Let me repeat that. An estimated 19 million black babies have been killed by abortion since 1973. Minorities have been the unwitting victims of a hidden racist agenda of the abortion industry for more than 50 years. All the more reason to support women, to support mothers, and to support them in their efforts to choose life. And I yield back.
Mr. Wahlberg yields back. Ms. Bonamici, for what purpose do you seek
Move to strike
recognition?
the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I strongly oppose this amendment for many reasons. I know my colleague from Connecticut just mentioned the comment about the Christian thing to do. I just note that not everyone is Christian. I want to make sure that our committee is making very sound policy decisions, as we should be doing as members of Congress. And reiterate again my point that it is not our role as members of Congress to make intensely personal decisions for pregnant college students. We certainly don't want to force anyone to get an abortion, but it sounds like my colleagues want to force everyone to bear a child, which is a tremendously consequential decision that, again, needs to be made by the pregnant college student, not by us as members of Congress. But I wonder if the sponsor of the amendment would yield to a question? Representative Good, would you yield to a question?
Yes, ma'am.
You cited some statistics, not only in your amendment, but now just in your oral remarks. Could you please let the committee know the basis of and the source of the statistics that you're putting in your amendment and that you mentioned in your comments? Are they from a single place or various scientific journals, medical journals? I yield for a response.
If the gentlelady will bear with me for a moment, I do have the source. We will follow up with you and with the committee and submit in writing the sources, if you will.
Reclaiming my time, I think it would be useful to have that information on the record, Representative and Madam Chair.
I agree with that. We'd be glad to submit that.
Terrific. I appreciate that. And again, encourage my colleagues to oppose this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Manning, seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I strongly oppose this amendment. This amendment provides proof of the increasingly accurate statement that politicians make lousy doctors. They also apparently make lousy researchers and lousy statisticians. I read the allegations stated in this amendment, and I can't help thinking that this is the kind of bald assertion that would be thrown out of a courtroom for lack of proper foundation. Where is the scientific evidence alleged? Where are those stories? And are those stories actually proof of what's taking place among women who have abortions? And where is the other side of the story? Where is the proof of the damage done to women who are unable to obtain abortions, or women who are unable to obtain the kind of miscarriage care they need, like Ms. Cox of Texas, a case that we all read about with horror in the recent newspapers. Our job here is not to pass legislation that's full of unsupported assertions presented as facts without actual support. Let's not present one-sided allegations in our legislation. Let's not fill the CFR with unsubstantiated allegations that parades as data and actual facts. Let's have a real discussion about the support pregnant women need if that's what this bill is actually about. I echo the question raised by my colleague, Representative Bonamici. If this is a real issue, let's have a real discussion with the facts in front of us. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back.
Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question's on the amendment by the gentleman from Virginia. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Mr. Scott asked for a recorded vote. A roll call vote is ordered. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Manning, seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6914 offered by Ms. Manning of North Carolina. Identifier AMD_02.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This bill that we're discussing today has a major flaw which my amendment would fix. The bill focuses on providing information to students who become pregnant and decide to carry the pregnancy to term. But it does nothing to ensure that students have the knowledge and the ability to avoid unwanted pregnancies. If we really care about avoiding abortions, which is the real intent of this so-called Bill of Students' Rights, then information about contraception should be readily available to college students. My amendment ensures that institutions of higher education are able to share medically accurate and comprehensive information about sexual and reproductive health services, including contraception. Contraception is a basic health care that everyone should have the right and ability to use. Ensuring that students have access to medically accurate and comprehensive information about how to avoid pregnancies is vital to students, to keeping them safe, to keeping them healthy, and to keeping their mental health intact. Providing information to students so that they can access birth control helps students plan their futures. It helps them continue their education. It helps them work toward economic security. The Affordable Care Act helped contribute to a 30-year low in the rate of unintended pregnancies. Yet we are on the verge of reversing that accomplishment with unprecedented attacks on women's reproductive rights. 84% of voters support access to birth control at any time and with no restrictions. And nearly 8 in 10 voters, 78%, see contraception as a basic healthcare right for women. Yet we continue to face rollbacks in access to contraception and other basic reproductive services, including safe and legal abortions. Removing barriers to birth control so that people can plan, space, and prevent pregnancies helps women in their ability to pursue an education, their ability to prepare for and obtain a good job and pursue a successful career. We know that access to birth control is linked to women's greater educational and professional opportunities and increased lifetime earnings. We should not silence schools and their ability to provide information about sexual and reproductive health care services. If we really care about students, we should make sure they have access to contraception. Adolescents and young adults have high rates of unintended pregnancy. A 2016 study found that young adults with low incomes, women of color, and college-age adults had a particularly high rate of unintended pregnancy when compared to other groups. Another troubling statistic: a 2014 study found that misinformation and misperceptions about contraception, especially about the pill, are common in college-aged women, especially women of color. Many college-age women may be most interested in preventing pregnancies, and this bill does nothing to address that. If this committee is serious about ensuring that young women's reproductive health and rights are protected, then contraceptives must be part of that conversation. I think this amendment makes an important contribution to the health and well-being of our students and our students' rights. I urge the adoption of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Is there anyone who wishes to speak on the amendment by Ms. Manning? I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I must reluctantly oppose the amendment. We're here today to advance the Pregnant Students' Rights Act, which ensures that colleges and universities provide information about the rights and accommodations a college can directly offer a mother as she navigates pregnancy and parenting her child. Pregnant students deserve equal access to continue their post-secondary education, but for too long there's been a missing link. That missing link has been a gap in consistent and accessible information across campuses. This legislation is pro-student. Instead, the Democrat amendment would change the purpose of this narrowly tailored bill. The amendment is also unnecessary. This bill doesn't prevent colleges from distributing information. Instead, it ensures that students have complete information about the resources and accommodations available to them to carry their baby to term. I believe members on both sides of the aisle want to support women becoming mothers and college graduates. We should concentrate on that common goal. I urge my colleagues to take this opportunity to focus on the reforms this committee can make today. I yield back. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm in support of the amendment and just want to emphasize the fact that we must ensure that institutions are sharing information that is medically accurate and comprehensive. Having access to this information is vital to keeping students safe and healthy and helps them plan for their future and plan for their economic security. As my colleague mentioned, the Affordable Care Act has already helped contribute to a 30-year low in the rate of unintended pregnancies. And we're on the verge of reversing that accomplishment with unprecedented attacks on women's reproductive rights. I therefore think it's imperative that we ensure that schools provide accurate, comprehensive information about sexual and reproductive health services, and think this amendment makes an important contribution to the health and well-being of our students, and urge that the amendment be adopted. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to speak a moment about the amendment. I do support it. I want to thank the gentlelady for bringing it forward. I just want to remind folks, this is really, when we this is a great amendment, and it is absolutely necessary. But the overall bill, as we've talked about it, first of all, let me just say abortion is health care. And that's something that seems to have gotten lost. Knowledge is power, and of course, I don't think we need to be restricting our institutions and women for that matter. I do think that what has been provided and is provided in the affordable health care is certainly something that we need to continue, and all of these attempts that we seem to be making to abort that, to get rid of the affordable care, to make decisions for women. I just never understood why we don't have these kinds of discussions about what men ought to do with their bodies. We're going to talk about maybe they shouldn't have vasectomies if their wives don't have children already. I mean, I just think it's just ridiculous that government continues to get into the bedrooms and also to make decisions or try to make decisions about what women ought to do. And as women, we ought to be offended. I am. I would certainly support this amendment. Thank you, Representative Manning, for bringing it forward. I just wasn't going to sit here and not say that. Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? Ms. Stevens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I seek to strike the last word on this amendment.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
We are at an incredibly dire time as it pertains to what is happening to the dictates on higher education and what they are allowed to teach, what they are allowed to communicate, and what they are not. We are seeing in places across this country, West Virginia comes to mind, a stripping of the teaching of liberal arts. We have a governor of the state of Florida, a presidential contender, who has signed into law for his state legislation stripping away the proper teaching of history in this country. You see professors running away from their profession in droves. We come out of a COVID-19 pandemic where we saw, very surprisingly, debate about the scientific integrity of vaccines that were saving people's lives. And now here we are talking about my trailblazing and phenomenal colleague from the state of North Carolina, her amendment to just simply say that institutions of higher education will, based on this legislation, not be prohibited from sharing information about reproductive health, including contraception. We don't know what's going on in K through 12. I mean, some of these places, these guys aren't even teaching proper sexual health at the public schools now. Abstinence. I'm sure that saves lives. I'm sure that helps the future. Reproductive care, contraception, support the institutions of higher education, which are wildly under attack from a place maybe last century or the Middle Ages. I don't know where this stuff is coming from. But they're under attack about the proper teaching of science, of history, of liberal arts, and now we can't even do contraception. So yes, we're not in a packed hearing room. I think the media is all plugged into what's going on with some ongoing attack on the president's son. Let's focus on this, because you got a Supreme Court that's taken away women's rights. They're about to rule on contraception. We're trying to do something here in the House. I hope the American people are paying attention to who's supporting women's access to health care, reproductive rights, and contraception. Thank you, Congresswoman Manning, and I yield back.
Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment by the gentlewoman from North Carolina. All in favor say aye. All opposed say no. No. In the opinion chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is
Madam
not
Chair, I
agreed to.
seek a recorded vote.
In roll call vote is ordered pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Washington seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6914 offered by Ms. Jayapal of Washington, identifier AMD_04.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This bill is a thinly veiled attempt by anti-abortion Republicans to pressure students out of deciding to have abortions. Supporters of the bill claim they want to support pregnant students, But these same people oppose almost all the resources and support that would enable a student parent to thrive. My amendment would require schools to provide information on programs that support pregnant people and children, including Medicaid, SNAP, Title X, Title X family planning programs, and the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, also known as WIC. Not only have Republicans failed to mention these programs in the bill, but they've also tried to cut or end them. So far in this Congress, Republicans in the House voted to slash funding for WIC, to eliminate tens of thousands of child care assistance slots, and proposed cutting Medicaid funding by 28% over the next 10 years. Anti-abortion supporters that are pushing this bill oppose expanding Medicaid to cover more people, which would decrease the financial stress of a pregnancy for students. Young people typically have the highest uninsurance rates, with 14% of college students uninsured in 2020. Without health coverage, care for childbirth costs an average of $18,865. Republicans pushing this bill also oppose universal child care, which would allow student parents and all parents to receive child care without paying an arm and a leg. In 2022, the average cost of child care in King County, in my district, was $21,119, and Seattle costs can reach $30,000 annually per child. Most college students don't have full-time jobs, meaning under the status quo, students' parents would find it nearly impossible to come up with an extra $30,000 a year. Finally, supporters of this anti-choice bill oppose sharing resources about access to reproductive and abortion care. They oppose the right of pregnant people to receive abortion care, even in the case that pregnancy causes a medical emergency. Just look at Amanda Zurowski is one of those people who was denied emergency abortion care. Because Texas has such strict bans on essential reproductive care, she was denied an abortion until she became septic. As a result, she may have lost her ability to have children in the future. So what would the information this bill requires to be shared with students look like? Because of Republican opposition, the list of resources required by this bill would not include a way for student parents to deal with huge childcare expenses. The list of resources would not have a solution to the immense medical bills that student parents could face. The list would not include information on nutrition assistance, and the list of resources would certainly not include information on how to access life-saving reproductive care in the event of a medically necessary abortion. In stark contrast, Democrats are working tirelessly to deliver the resources that student parents, and all parents, frankly, need while preserving a person's right not to become a parent. In the House-passed Build Back Better Act, Democrats crafted policy to ensure that every family can afford child care, that health insurance must include maternity and newborn care, and that allows states to expand Medicaid to provide coverage for postpartum people and their children. Democrats have also been working overtime to protect reproductive rights from Republican attacks by passing the Women's Health Protection Act through the House of Representatives, not just once, but multiple times. Rather than support students who decide to become parents by providing access to Medicaid, WIC, and SNAP, and enacting bold additional social programs to provide childcare and health care, while also respecting students' decision to have or not have an abortion, this bill aims to pressure students out of abortions. The bill's proponents provide pregnant students with the empty promise of support, while those same people stand in the way of the resources that students actually and truly need. My amendment would ensure that pregnant students are aware of crucial social programs that can ease the burden of healthcare and food costs and truly support them. As one of the 1 in 4 women in America who has had an abortion, I'm grateful that I had access to information and to a doctor so that I could make the best decision for me, my health, and my family. I cannot imagine denying that same information to anyone, especially to our young people. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on my amendment. I yield back.
Does anyone seek recognition on the amendment? Now, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. I oppose the amendment. We are here today to advance the Pregnant Students' Rights Act, which ensures that colleges and universities provide information about the rights and accommodations a college can directly offer a mother as she navigates pregnancy and parenting her child. The bill already requires institutions to provide information about the resources available in the community. Colleges and universities are responsible for what happens in the classroom and in guiding a student's education pathway. Colleges and universities have control to approve altered class schedules, excused absences, and guidance at their health centers. This is vitally important information pregnant college students need to know. I urge my colleagues to take this opportunity to focus on the reforms this committee can make today. Thank you, and I yield back. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word in support of this amendment and agree that if the committee wants to fully support pregnant and parenting students, guiding them to helpful programs and supports would be a good first step. I'd also like to point out the efficacy and success of the programs listed in the amendment, such as Medicaid and WIC. And while claiming to support pregnant students, in reality, the underlying bill does not provide pregnant students with any new rights, does not provide students with any additional services that might help them, like child care, affordable family housing, nutrition, or financial aid. It does not provide students with greater access to family or medical leave from school or ensure that they can keep their scholarships. So I thank the gentlewoman for the amendment, urge my colleagues to support it, and yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Hayes, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I'd like to speak on the amendment.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word. When we first started discussing this, I referred to it as a thinly veiled anti-abortion legislation. It is not that thinly veiled anymore. And I applaud my colleagues for offering amendments that will actually make this anti-abortion legislation. Amendments that will help when women are faced with the critical choice of what decision they have to make. That decision will be easier for them to choose to the path of motherhood because they have a supportive community around them, because they have affordable housing, because they have WIC and nutrition programs, because they have childcare, because they have all of the things that weigh on a woman when she is making that decision. So if my colleagues truly want to make this about making it anti-abortion legislation, let's make the decision easier for young girls, for young students, for young women who have to make that choice and are often making it alone without the resources that would be available to raise a child, not just birth a child. So I appreciate my colleague, Representative Jayapal, for introducing this amendment, for making sure that as students are making this choice of whether or not to have a child, that they could say ultimately, I don't have to worry about how I'm going to feed this child because these are the programs that are available to me. It's not just about picking a class schedule. Newsflash, that is not the only thing that pregnant students have to worry about, is the availability of classes when they're making the choice of whether or not to have a child. So if we truly want to strengthen this legislation, let's provide all the resources to not just have a child, but to raise a child. Let's put some of those programs back in place that we were able to get passed as Democrats in the American Rescue Plan. Let's put the child tax credit and child care resources back in place so that these young girls who are making the choices of what to do academically will also have all of the resources to raise their children. So again, we have a tremendous opportunity to make this legislation even better if we truly care about offering choice to young women to choose to have a child, to also give them the resources to raise that child. I support this amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, and I yield back.
Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? Ms. Leisure Fernandez, You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
So I thank Representative Jayapal for this amendment because precisely what we heard from my colleague Representative Hayes, it is important that we make sure that our students on our college campuses have full information about the resources available to them. What we are seeing right now with this bill itself is that extreme Republicans, they want women to stay in the dark. They do not want women, whether they are on college campuses, in our rural communities, or our suburban areas, to know what is available to them. They do not want them to know that they have full access to reproductive health care, that they have full access to an abortion if that is what they choose. This bill would shut that off. When you read this bill, you are incensed by both the findings of Congress and then the one-sided nature of the bill. And this amendment that my wonderful esteemed colleague has brought is aimed to bring a little light into that darkness that extreme Republicans want to keep women in. They want to prevent women students from having informed choice about what to do with their pregnancies. They want to dictate from Congress what students should know about that health care. We need to keep Congress out of women's doctors' offices. We need to keep Congress out of the decisions that women must make in consultation with their own faith, their own doctors, their own loved ones. And that is a bit of what we are fighting today. So I am in favor of keeping Congress out of these decisions that women deserve to make, whether it is on campuses in rural areas or in suburbia. I am in favor of this amendment, which would bring some light to this area. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment. I urge my colleagues to defeat this bill. With that, I yield back.
Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment by the gentlewoman from Connecticut. All in favor, say aye. Pardon me, the gentlewoman from Washington. Aye. No. All in favor say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
Ms. Jayapal asks for a recorded vote. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. Oops, that's okay. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Michigan seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6914 offered by Ms. Stevens of Michigan. Identifier AMD_05.
The gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment makes clear that this bill will not prevent institutions of higher education from disseminating information on resources, including available rights, protections, and accommodations under Title IX regarding pregnancy and pregnancy-related conditions, including miscarriage. We are talking about access to information for college students, for pregnant college students. 75 to 80% of miscarriages occur in the first 12 weeks of a pregnancy. We know that by some accounts, 10 to 20% of pregnancies end in miscarriage, that there is even some research that cites upwards of 30% of pregnancies ending in miscarriages, stillbirths affecting about 1 in 175 births. Allow me to reiterate as well that we have a maternal mortality crisis in this country. It is ballooning. We have a black maternal mortality crisis in this country. If you do not have access to information about what is happening when you are having a miscarriage, what do you do? A colleague on the other side of the aisle, while introducing another amendment, talked about the emotional effects on women who have abortion, that it is so difficult for them emotionally. Yes, the act of getting pregnant, of reckoning with being pregnant, whether planned or unplanned, and going through it is emotional. My colleague might not recognize that that's called hormones. What happens to women while they are going through a miscarriage? Severe cramping, blood clotting, pain, urinary issues, dizziness, headaches. We now know that in places, in states, in the United States of America, where, quote, abortion is now illegal, if you are having a miscarriage, you don't get access to that health care. That's happening. A woman in Ohio is sent home while she's having a miscarriage. Women in Texas bleeding out. I keep a file. People magazine talks about this stuff. Parents not able to grieve with a stillborn because of laws. We're talking about rights, and we're talking about access to information. So I'm quite curious and interested on if my amendment could be unanimously adopted for the Pregnant Student Rights Act. Because my goodness gracious, upwards of 30% potentially suffering miscarriage. Should you just be left to bleed out in your dorm room? Call home, maybe drop out for a semester? What about those Title IX protections that give you that time off, that give you that reason? Are you supposed to make a Facebook post, a social media post, that you got pregnant and you've got rights and my goodness gracious, hopefully I don't have a miscarriage? I have witnessed, as many, I believe, have witnessed the aftermath of a miscarriage. It is so painful to see a family member, to see a loved one, a dear friend go through something like that. So I really hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are talking about the emotional impacts of abortion will certainly join me in supporting this amendment for college students who might go through something of that nature. God forbid, a miscarriage. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? Ms. Manning, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in strong support of my colleague, Representative Stevens' amendment. We know that 1 in 4 pregnancies results in a miscarriage. That's right, 1 in 4 pregnancies. Some miscarriages happen early. Some miscarriages happen tragically later in a pregnancy. Some miscarriages are ectopic pregnancies, which can put a woman's life at risk. And just as every pregnancy puts incredible stress on a woman's body, a doctor in one of our recent hearings said that every pregnancy is a high-risk pregnancy. Every miscarriage can put a woman's health at risk if not handled properly. There is a lack of information about miscarriages, and because of the abortion bans that have been enacted in states across this country, abortion bans that are poorly considered, and as I said earlier, prove once again that politicians make poor doctors. We now have women who are experiencing miscarriages who are not able to get the standard of care treatment for their miscarriages because doctors in states that have abortion bans are desperately afraid of being accused of performing an abortion when they're helping a woman manage a miscarriage. They're afraid of losing their licenses, and they're afraid of being criminally prosecuted for a miscarriage. So at the very least, if we actually care about pregnant students and students who are dealing with pregnancies, we should be including in this so-called Bill of Rights access to information about how to deal with a miscarriage if you are a student, where to get the resources to deal with a miscarriage. We ought to make sure that schools have accurate information and that their health departments are available to provide the necessary support. I therefore urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone else seek recognition? Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word and speak in favor of the amendment.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and colleagues. I strongly support the amendment introduced by my colleague from Michigan, Representative Stevens. As I said in the introduction of my amendment earlier, which was to permit schools to share medically accurate and comprehensive information about abortion, and this additional amendment by Representative Stevens is consistent with that. Under Title IX currently, students who have abortions are protected from discrimination under Title IX, as I mentioned. And since 1975, regulations implementing Title IX have expressly prohibited discrimination against students on the basis of pregnancy and related medical conditions, which of course would include miscarriage. But we're in a different world now from 1975 post-Dobbs, and there are, as we've heard in this debate today, increasingly concerning situations arising when women are having miscarriages and cannot get the care they need. So anything we can do to clarify that and to support students who are going through that incredibly difficult situation, let's include that as well. I still will oppose the underlying bill, but this is a good amendment to, in fact, improve the information available to students, and I yield back.
Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment from the gentlewoman from Michigan? Ms. Hayes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I rise in support of this amendment. As I said at the beginning of this hearing, on its face, I am in favor of giving students access to information. But as I am hearing the amendments that are coming from my Republican colleagues, it is actually diminishing this bill and calling it out for what it is. So if we can include Democratic amendments that actually strengthen the legislation to make sure that as we are giving information, we are giving all the information, that we are making students aware of potential complications and what to do in those cases. Pregnancy is a scary time. It's something that comes with many joys, but also it is a medical journey. It's a medical experience, and many young women, students, will have to face this alone. So if we are talking about truly giving information, then we should give all the information. I am just listening very intently and watching to see if these dreadful amendments that have been offered from the other side pass, because that diminishes the spirit of this legislation and the purpose of what it is we are supposedly here to do, and that is provide students with all of the information, all of the resources that are available to them when they are making the decision about a pregnancy. So I guess what I would say is this will be the test of that. If my Republican colleagues truly want to provide students with all the information, then why would we stop at just information about birth? Why wouldn't we give all the information? That's what I've heard over and over. Students have the right. I mean, the title of the legislation is Students' Rights to Pregnancy Information. Why wouldn't we give them all of the information? So I strongly support the the amendment that is put forth by my colleague from Michigan. I think it would strengthen our attempts to provide students with all of the information, not filter the information, not give them some of the information. If this bill is as good as they say it is, then what are we afraid of? Why are we afraid of students having all of the information and making the most informed choices? I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and with that, I yield back.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I oppose the amendment. As I've already stated, we're here to move forward an extremely pro-student, narrowly tailored bill. I must reiterate, this bill doesn't prevent colleges from distributing information, but the purpose of the Pregnant Students' Rights Act was to ensure that critical information is distributed that will help a pregnant mother make the class accommodations she needs and be connected to critical resources to support her baby. We've already heard from members today that the underlying bill is one we can all support. Thank you. I yield back. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question's on the amendment by the gentlewoman from Michigan. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. No. In the opinion chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Ms. Stevens' request a recorded vote. A roll call vote is ordered. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition? My understanding is that you will be offering an amendment originally proposed by Mr. Courtney. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment, the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6914, offered by Ms. Hayes of Connecticut, identifier COURTN_054.
On this amendment, I will reserve a point of order. The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you. In 2021, Congress secured an expanded child tax credit in the American Rescue Plan. The expanded child tax credit reached more than 61 million children and lifted 4 million out of poverty in 2021 alone. This legislation was championed by Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro from the state of Connecticut. The child tax credit is one of the most effective tools for supporting students who are pregnant or having children. Moreover, since the expanded child tax credit expired at the end of 2021, we have seen drastic increases in child poverty. The U.S. Census Bureau tracked a nearly 141% increase from 2021 to 2022. This amendment, which I am introducing on behalf of Representative Courtney, would add the American Family Act, originally introduced to Congress by our colleague from Connecticut, Rosa DeLauro. The American Family Act would increase the minimum child tax credit and make benefits payable monthly for all children under age 17. It would make the child tax credit fully refundable and would index the tax credit for inflation. Under the current structure, many pregnant students and students who are parents would not even receive the full child tax credit because they don't make enough money. By making the child tax credit fully refundable, a mother with no income or low income, which is likely for students who are finishing their schooling while raising a child, would still be eligible to receive the full credit. The current child tax credit only begins to phase in after a taxpayer has earned $2,500 of income and 15 cents for every dollar of additional income. Because the child tax credit is not fully refundable, about 24 million low-income children receive a smaller credit than middle-class families because their families' earnings are too low. I will be withdrawing this amendment, but I hope we can work together in the future to ensure that we provide substantial support to pregnant students and student parents as they're moving forward. But again, if we are truly trying to help support children, if we are truly trying to provide the resources for women who are making the very difficult decision about how to navigate a pregnancy that was unexpected, I say unexpected and not unwanted, because as a mother, There's, as my colleague, Ms. Stevens, said, you go through a series of emotions. So as you are navigating an unexpected pregnancy, Congress does have the ability to put supports in place to help us raise healthy, productive children, to help us thrive in those circumstances. And the fact that none of the amendments here today that have been offered on the other side to support this legislation would support that, I think really is telling. So again, I think we really need to think about how we truly help students, how we truly support children, and what we can do as a Congress to make that happen. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Does the gentlewoman wish to withdraw her amendment?
Yes, I will be withdrawing it. I just think it's very important to have it on the record that the child tax credit is out there as an option for us.
Is there further debate on the amendment? The gentlewoman withdraws the amendment. The question now occurs. We will now move to consider the next bill. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the bill H.R. 443 for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 443, a bill to direct the Secretary of Labor to train certain employees of Department of Labor how to effectively detect and assist law enforcement in preventing human trafficking during the course of their official duties and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, the bill would be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. The clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 443 offered by Mr. Wahlberg of Michigan, identifier ANS H.R. 443.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text for purposes of further amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed. I now recognize Congressman Wahlberg for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since 2010, the United States has recognized January as National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month. So I thank the committee for including my bipartisan bill with Representative Sablon in today's markup. H.R. 443, the Enhancing Detection of Human Trafficking Act, would ensure the Department of Labor has a formal framework in place to educate staff on the best practices to detect and refer cases of suspected human trafficking. Labor trafficking is the illegal exploitation of an individual for commercial gain. It knows no geographical limits. From the Mariana Islands to my home state of Michigan, cases of trafficking can happen anywhere to anyone. Victims of labor trafficking can be young children, teenagers, or adult men and women. While a lot of work has been done over the years to raise awareness about the terrible crime, sadly, events over the past year have demonstrated that more measures are necessary. In April of last year, the New York Times reported on many children being trafficked and forced to work illegally in the United States following their release from federal custody to sponsors who were supposedly vetted by the federal government. This breakdown in federal agencies' ability to keep children out of harm's way underscores the need to ensure that federal officials are properly educated in the signs of human trafficking. While I'm sure there is more work to be done at other federal agencies, this committee has jurisdiction over the Department of Labor, specifically Wage and Hour Division and Occupational Safety and Health Administration employees through the course of inspecting workplace safety and labor law compliance within the United States. These employees often have a frontline opportunity to identify patterns of labor exploitation. Providing these employees with a proper education on how to detect and respond to the signs of human trafficking is an important part of the larger comprehensive effort to eradicate this unthinkable crime. Specifically, H.R. 443 would direct the Department of Labor to educate appropriate staff on how to effectively detect instances of human trafficking, ensure personal regularly receive information on current trends and best practices, allow flexible education options, including in-class and virtual learning options, establish a clear course of action for referring suspected instances of human trafficking to law enforcement, and require a report to Congress on the implementation of the education and processes used by the department to measure and track its agencies and law enforcement responses to human trafficking. An earlier version of this bill passed the House unanimously in 2017. The updated text we are considering today incorporates technical assistance from the Department of Labor, and this amendment, in the nature of a substitute, makes other technical changes to the bill to improve clarity after receiving feedback from Legislative Counsel. I would like to especially thank my colleague Representative Sablan and his team for their strong partnership and advocacy on this bill throughout the years. One of the biggest obstacles we face in the fight against human trafficking awareness, H.R. 443 will ensure Department of Labor employees are equipped with the knowledge and the processes to catch traffickers and keep them from inflicting more harm on individuals. I urge adoption of this aims and passage by the committee. I yield back.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word. Madam Chair, I want to first thank Congressman Wahlberg for his leadership on combating human trafficking and for introducing this legislation, of which I am an original co-sponsor. Human trafficking is a scourge that preys on the most vulnerable, subjecting more than 27 million people around the world and thousands here in the United States to abhorrent working and living conditions. Eradicating all cases of human trafficking first requires an awareness of where it exists. And as the federal agencies that oversees labor laws, the Department of Labor is uniquely positioned to identify patterns of labor exploitation. And that is why Representative Wahlberg and I introduced H.R. 443, the Enhancing Detection of Human Trafficking Act. The bipartisan bill directs the Department of Labor to train appropriate department staff on how to detect human trafficking and ensure that personnel at the Department of Labor are provided with regular screening tools to identify and detect trafficking activity. The bill also requires the department to report back to Congress within a year on the progress that is being made on such efforts. I have seen cases of this terrible crime firsthand, even in my own district, the Northern Mariana Islands. In the past, several construction companies have lured non-U.S. workers to come to the Marianas with false promises and misrepresentations about pay and conditions and work conditions. The companies then withheld the employees' wages and confiscated their passports. The workers were subjected to inhumane working conditions, crowded unsanitary barracks with barely enough food and water. They were forced to work in unsafe conditions, some suffering serious injuries without access to adequate medical care. There was even a workplace fatality. And to their credit, the Department of Labor's OSHA and H&R divisions have worked to address these crimes, issuing fines and citations and recovering wages. But these grave injustices that rob people of their freedom and sometimes their lives are preventable. Congress can and must do more to hold human traffickers accountable. And while we have bipartisan support today, it would be remiss of me not to call out my colleagues, my Republican colleagues' efforts in this Congress to slash funding across labor enforcement agencies in their fiscal year 24 labor aids appropriations bills. Such spending cuts would jeopardize the department's ability to crack down on labor abuses. And so while I support HR 443, I want to remind my colleagues across the aisle that sufficient funding is necessary to ensure an effective whole-of-government approach to eliminating human trafficking in the United States. And I want to take this time also to congratulate my good friend for the Wolverines and National Championship win. It was a nice game. Thank you. Madam Chair, thank you, and I yield back. That balance my time.
Thank you, Mr. Sablan. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word and speak in favor of the amendment in the nature of the substitute.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I support the legislation, and I thank my colleagues for bringing it forward, but I urge our committee to take additional actions to end the heinous and exploitive crime of trafficking. I appreciate the leadership of the Biden administration to combat and end human trafficking. Currently, the Department of Labor leads enforcement against trafficking for labor, as well as an interagency task force to crack down on child labor trafficking, and I join my colleague, Representative Sablan, in urging full funding for those efforts. Other agencies also have funding and resources available for training. And in addition to the bill we're considering today, there are several bipartisan measures we could and should consider that would invest in services and expand training to combat human trafficking. For example, I have introduced the bipartisan bicameral Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act, which would establish requirements for training on human trafficking, trauma, sexual abuse, and assault prevention, and response for programs that serve youth experiencing homelessness. This bill is in the jurisdiction of this committee. The bill also requires that organizations that participate in the Basic Center program, which is through the Family and Youth Bureau at Department of Health and Human Services, this helps create and strengthen community-based programs that meet the needs of runaway and homeless youth under the age of 18. My bill will help conduct outreach to survivors of sexual abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. And the bill, the bipartisan bicameral bill I'm discussing, also extends transitional living program services to survivors of trafficking. This bill is one example of additional action our committee could take to address and end trafficking beyond the bill under consideration today. So I respectfully ask the chair to work with me and my bipartisan co-sponsors to schedule the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act for committee markup. Again, I support this bill and look forward to working on the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act as well, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to second last word. Madam Chair, at its core, this bill acknowledges the long understood truth that our Department of Labor plays a critical role in fighting human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor every day. The wage and hour inspectors, as it's been pointed out, are on the front lines. They are uniquely situated to identify suspect labor arrangements as they conduct interviews with business owners and employees and review personnel records. They already work closely with the Department of Justice, Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Homeland Security and other law enforcement partners to make referrals, receive referrals for investigation, and assist in restitution for victims. According to the most recent annual data from the Department of Justice, DOL's Wage and Labor Division made 9 referrals to federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies or task forces, made 2 referrals of H-visa cases to DOL's Office of Inspector General regarding allegations of human trafficking, and participated in over 100 task forces, work groups, and coalitions across the country with the main goal of combating human trafficking. The Department of Labor is already far beyond the need for training its staff in trafficking. What we really need is more more resources to protect children and other workers who are trafficked. One of the adjustments made in the ANS appears to task the Department of Labor with oversight that the Department of Justice is appropriately responding to cases it's referred related to the detection of human trafficking. But without additional funding, additional responsibility required out current activities of the workforce protection agencies. And regrettably, the bill does not offer any additional investment in these agencies. I'd remind our colleagues on the other side of the aisle that failing to adequately protect our nation's workers does not come without a cost. Currently, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, only has enough inspectors to inspect each American workplace once every 190 years. This is unacceptable, and regrettably, Appropriations Committee Republicans have been cutting the funding that's there even further. Now, if colleagues are serious about cracking down on human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor, now is the time to come to the table and support serious investments in our nation's workforce and protection agencies. But as far as the bill goes, it is a step in the right direction. So I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment in nature substitute and the bill, and yield back the balance of my time.
Are there any other members?
Madam Chair. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word. I do want to support the enhancing the detection of human trafficking act. As we acknowledge National Trafficking Prevention Month, it's important to acknowledge the global horror of human trafficking. In North Carolina alone, the Human Trafficking Hotline has received more than 8,000 signals since its inception in 2007. In 2021, there were a total of 922 signals received by the hotline. 318 were from victims or survivors. My home state of North Carolina is among the most affected states. Major interstate highways, a large and transient military population, numerous rural agricultural areas with a high demand for cheap labor, and increased gang activity all contribute to making our state a hotbed for human trafficking. Nationally, the Department of State estimates that there are 27.6 million victims of human trafficking worldwide. And these victims are preyed upon regardless of age, regardless of background or nationality. They're exploited, they're enslaved for the marginal profits of a few. And this is why ending human trafficking is a bipartisan issue, and it must be a priority. As members of Congress, we must stand up for justice and human dignity for those workers who are deceived by companies and individuals that use deceptive recruiting practices to lure victims. These victims experience low-paying jobs, unsafe working conditions. The Department of Labor has worked tirelessly to combat trafficking of persons within the United States and abroad by enforcing labor protections, assisting survivors, and monitoring trafficking internationally. Currently, to the most recent year for which DOJ provides data, DOL's Wage and Hour Division made 9 referrals to federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies or task forces regarding allegations of human trafficking, and participates in over 100 task forces, work groups, and coalitions across the country with the main goal of combating human trafficking. Forced child labor, which are labor schemes in which traffickers compel children to work, are one of many forms of trafficking. As of July, the Wage and Hour Division had more than 700 open child labor cases. Between October 2022 and the middle of July of 23, the Hour and Wage Division concluded 765 labor cases involving almost 4,500 children. This is a 44% increase in the number of children found in child labor violations for the same period a year before. So I do urge my colleagues to continue this fight by protecting our workers. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Are there other members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? There being no further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. Give me the amendment. Ms. Adams, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have an
The
amendment.
clerk. Yeah. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 443 offered by Ms. Adams of North Carolina. Identifier H.R. 443_PCA.
Does the gentleman from Michigan wish to be recognized?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman reserves a point of order. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the word and speak in support of the amendment. The amendment acknowledges the important role that our Department of Labor plays fighting human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor. However, it does not go nearly far enough. The Department of Labor is already referring cases, including cases of suspected trafficking, to the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, and other appropriate agencies. So this bill would potentially just codify existing practices. More is needed to effectively combat child labor, which is so closely interrelated. And this is why my committee Democrats have twice requested a hearing on child labor, but the chairwoman has dismissed these as pretty much as, and we haven't had one. But this amendment would incorporate Ranking Member Scott's Protecting Children Act, which would also renew our commitment to ending oppressive child labor by increasing civil and criminal penalties for child labor violations, unsafe workplaces, and workplace injuries and deaths experienced by these young workers. It would also strengthen the Wage and Hour Division's ability to prevent the sale and movement of goods produced in violation of child labor rules. It would improve the process for updating child labor rules and prohibiting any future weakening of those rules. It would also launch public information initiatives to keep policymakers and the public informed about child labor enforcement, and it would train young workers about their rights. It's simply unacceptable that abusive child labor practices are rising. I do urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak on the amendment? Does the gentleman from Michigan insist on the point of order?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do insist on the point of order pursuant to Clause 7 of Rule 16 of the Rules of the House of Representatives. The amendment is not germane to the underlying bill, as the subject matter of the amendment offered is different from that of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The subject matter of the amendment in the nature of a substitute is for H.R. 443, is providing education to Department of Labor employees regarding detecting instances of trafficking. It does not amend the Fair Labor Standards Act. The amendment, on the other hand, amends the Fair Labor Standards Act and therefore relates to a subject matter that is different than the underlying bill. I yield back.
Madam Chair? May I comment?
The gentlewoman yielded back her time. I'll recognize the gentleman from Virginia.
On the point of order.
On the point of order.
She didn't speak on the point of order.
Thank you. You're correct. Thank you, Madam. Ms. Adams, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me just say that this amendment is germane because the subject of this bill is the Department of Labor's responsibility in cases of labor trafficking, and this amendment empowers the department to take effective steps to stop the labor trafficking of children. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Is there further debate on the rule of order? The chair is prepared to rule. The gentleman has made a point of order that the amendment is beyond the bill's subject matter. Germaneness is construed narrowly in order to support informed consideration of legislation. The chair finds the amendment as beyond the bill's subject matter. The amendment is a proposition on a subject different from that under consideration within the meaning of Clause 7 of Rule 16 of the House Rules. Therefore, the amendment is not germane. The point of order is sustained.
Madam Chair, I challenge the ruling of the chair. I think it's important that this amendment actually be adopted.
All right, the gentleman has challenged the ruling of the chair. All those in favor say aye.
And the motion is, shall the ruling of the chair be sustained?
The motion is, shall the ruling of the chair be sustained?
Support of your appeal of the chair.
Well, you can state it the way you want it. Usually, shall the ruling of the chair be sustained?
Okay, I got it.
Well, here, one moment.
He can't.
Madam Chair, I move to table the appeal.
The motion on the floor is to table the appeal of the gentleman from Virginia to the ruling of the chair. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. For what purpose does the gentlewoman, Ms. Omar, seek recognition?
Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 443 offered by Ms. Omar of Minnesota, identifier H.R. 443_WHD.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Chairwoman. While I intend to support this bill, I hope my Republican colleagues know that it falls short of substantial change. This legislation has no new funding for the proposed training and reporting requirements, most of which are already standard practice within DOL. And more importantly, it fails to address the root causes of trafficking in any meaningful way. Many of the most at risk of being trafficked are undocumented immigrants who are afraid of reporting their abuse because they might be deported if they do. The current mission of House Republicans is to make that harder for these victims by creating an even more punitive immigration system. How do we expect people to tell their stories to DOL investigators when there is no guarantee that they will be protected from retaliation from their employers? When employers threaten people with deportation, there is nothing wrong with setting up additional training to help people identify victims of trafficking. But what good does it do to identify victims if we cannot also protect them? We need to be having more serious, thoughtful discussions. Committee Republicans have not even held a hearing on child labor issues, even though child labor violations have increased by almost 400% over the last decade. We should be marking up more impactful bills, from enhancing supply chain accountability to strongly penalizing illegal labor practices. We should be guaranteeing protection from deportation for victims of trafficking, allowing them the freedom of speaking to investigators or law enforcement without fear. Given what is before us today, I do think that there are ways to strengthen this bill to be more responsive to victims' rights. That is why I am offering an amendment to incorporate best practices for ensuring protections for the rights of victims within the required training. This would include collaboration with state and local officials and community organizations. For example, let's take my home state of Minnesota and its safe harbor laws. Mirrors in over 30 other states which protect exploited children from criminal prosecution. Because we enacted these laws, state and local officials are well positioned to work with federal agencies to ensure that enforcement is done carefully and effectively within the protection of underage sex trafficking victims in mind. Additionally, my amendment would also emphasize DOL training efforts in states that have significant increases in child labor violations. As it stands, this bill does the bare minimum to identify suspected victims and go after human traffickers. And while my amendment signifies a step forward, much more necessary comprehensive reform, I urge this committee to take on a more serious approach to this issue, centered on human rights of our most vulnerable. I urge my colleagues to support this sensible amendment. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek to be recognized?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And the language of this amendment certainly is within the confines of what we want to do. We have no opposition to protecting victims and encouraging the best use of this legislation if enacted. So I don't oppose and stand in support of the amendment.
Thank you. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment from Ms. Omar? If not, the question is on the amendment by Ms. Omar. All in favor say aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 443 offered by Mr. Norcross of New Jersey, identifier H.R. 443_LIC.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word and speak in support of this amendment. It's certainly a good idea, and I want to start out by thanking both sponsors of this bill. The idea of human trafficking in this day and age, in any day and age, is just revolting, and I'm glad that you're doing this. And the idea of training the DOL for their staff on spotting possible human trafficking and reporting it to other agencies. And that's what my amendment speaks to, is we're committed to ending labor or trafficking. DOL needs to take a government as a whole approach to make sure that we all work in the same direction, no matter what level we are. So very simply, this talks about working together, that in the event that DOL refers a possible labor trafficking case to the appropriate authorities, including state, local businesses, and certainly professional licensing authority. And we know there are so many levels of government, and there are many ways to approach this. So the idea of adding the state and local businesses and professional licensing bodies, I think is critical to making sure that we take the approach that we go all possible places that we could have an impact. But at this time, I'm going to withdraw the amendment with the understanding that the sponsors and Madam Chairwoman will work together to include the language to make sure that we are in together. So with that, I'll withdraw with the understanding that we'll work with the sponsors.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the intent that my colleague from New Jersey and my fellow Harley rider makes with this. We want to make sure that all effort is made to deal with this issue. We also want to make sure, as we've discussed about victims' rights, that we do it in a way that we don't cross boundaries and make it more difficult for Justice Department to deal with it. So I will make the commitment that we work together as this moves toward the floor of the House and we come to, I trust, an agreement in the process, and I'll do that in all good faith.
Certainly appreciate it, and I yield back.
The gentleman withdraws his amendment and yields back. The committee will now recess subject to the call of the chair. The committee will come to order. The unfinished business before the committee consists of the request for roll call votes. We'll now be voting on 6 amendments to the bill H.R. 6914. The first amendment is the amendment offered by Congresswoman Bonamici. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson?
No.
Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Walberg?
No.
Mr. Walberg votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Owens? Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes no. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes no. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Ms. Lutlow? Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes no. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes no. Mr. James? Ms. Chavez-DeReamer? Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes no. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Saban? Mr. Saban votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. McBath? Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Ledger Fernandez? Ms. Ledger Fernandez votes aye. Ms. Manning? Mr. Mervan? Mr. Bowman?
The clerk will call the names of any members who are not recorded.
Mr. Comer? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Owens? Ms. Lutlow? Ms. Lutlow votes no. Mr. James? Ms. Wilson? Mr. Norcross? Ms. Wild? Ms. McBath? Ms. Omar? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Manning? Mr. Mervan? Mr. Bowman?
How is Mr. James? How is Mr. James?
Mr.
recorded?
James is not recorded. Mr. James votes no. Mr. Takano is recorded as a yes.
How is Mr. Owens recorded?
Mr. Owens is not recorded. Mr. Owens votes no.
How is Mr. Mervan recorded?
Mr. Mervan is not recorded. Mr. Mervan votes yes.
And how is Ms. Manning recorded?
Ms. Manning is not recorded. Ms. Manning votes yes.
How is Ms. Stevens and Mr. Norcross recorded?
Ms. Stevens is not recorded. Ms. Stevens votes yes. Mr. Norcross is not recorded. Mr. Norcross votes yes.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 23 noes and 15 yeas.
Sorry. The amendment is not adopted. The next vote is on the amendment offered by Mr. Good. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
Yes.
Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes yes. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes yes. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes yes. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes yes. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes yes. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes yes. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes yes. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes yes. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes yes. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes yes. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes yes. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes yes. Ms. Latlow? Ms. Latlow votes yes. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes aye. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes yes. Mr. James? Mr. James votes yes. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer? Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes no. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes yes. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes yes. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. McBath? Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no. Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes no. Mr. Bowman?
How is Mr. Smucker recorded?
Mr. Smucker is not recorded. Mr. Smucker votes yes.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 23 yeas and 17 nays.
The amendment is adopted. The next vote is on the amendment offered by Ms. Manning. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson? No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes no. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller? Ms. Miller votes no. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Ms. Latlow? Ms. Latlow votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes no. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes no. Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer? Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes yes. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams. Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Saunier. Mr. Saunier votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Wild. Ms. McBath. Ms. Hayes. Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar votes aye. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes yes. Ms. Manning. Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan. Mr. Mervan votes yes. Mr. Bowman.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 17 yeas and 23 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next vote is on the amendment offered by Ms. Jayapal. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox.
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson. No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson. No. Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Comer. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good. Mr. Good votes no. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller. Ms. Miller votes no. Ms. Steele. Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes no. Ms. Letlow. Ms. Letlow votes no. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean. Mr. Bean votes no. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran votes no. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes no. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin. Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva votes yes. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Sablon. Mr. Sablon votes yes. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano. Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams. Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Saunier. Mr. Saunier votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath. Ms. Hayes. Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar votes aye. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes yes. Ms. Manning. Ms. Manning votes yes. Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan. Mr. Mervan votes aye. Mr. Bowman.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 17 yeas and 24 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next vote is on the amendment offered by Congresswoman Stevens. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox.
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson. No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Thompson. No. Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Comer. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Good. Mr. Good votes no. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean votes no. Ms. Miller. Ms. Miller votes no. Ms. Steele. Ms. Steele votes no. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes no. Ms. Letlow. Ms. Letlow votes no. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Kiley votes no. Mr. Bean. Mr. Bean votes no. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran votes no. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer. Ms. Chavez-DeReamer votes no. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes no. Ms. Houchin. Ms. Houchin votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes aye. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Bonamici. Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano. Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams. Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Saunier. Mr. Saunier votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath. Ms. Hayes. Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar votes aye. Ms. Stevens. Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes yes. Ms. Manning. Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan. Mr. Mervan votes aye. Mr. Bowman.
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 17 yeas and 24 nays.
The amendment is not adopted. The next vote is on the amendment offered by Congresswoman Hayes. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox votes no. Mr. Wilson?
I'm sorry.
Point of order, Madam Chair. Did she withdraw that?
Sorry. What do you say? Oh, I'm sorry. We'll now be voting on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6914 as amended. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I now entertain a motion to report the bill, H.R. 6914, as amended, and recognize Mrs. Miller.
I move the Committee on Education and the Workforce report the bill H.R. 6914 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended, and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 6914 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Mr. Scott requests a recorded vote. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
Aye.
Ms. Fox votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Aye. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Aye. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes yes. Ms. McLean?
Aye.
Ms. McLean votes yes. Ms. Miller?
Yes.
Ms. Miller votes yes. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes aye. Mr. Estes?
Aye.
Mr. Estes votes aye. Ms. Letlow? Ms. Letlow votes yes. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes aye. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes aye. Mr. James? Mr. James votes aye. Ms. Chavez-Dreamer? Mr. Chavez-Dreamer votes yes. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes yes. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes yes. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Saulnier? Mr. Saulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no. Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes no. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes no. Mr. Bowman?
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there were 24 yeas and 17 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion's agreed to. H.R. 6914 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. I'll now entertain a motion by Mr. Wahlberg to report H.R. 443, and I recognize Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move the Committee on Education and the Workforce report the bill H.R. 443 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended, and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
Before we vote on reporting it as amended, we do need to vote on the bill in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 443 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Who's asking?
Madam Chair, I ask for a roll call vote.
Mr. Wilson asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Fox?
Yes.
Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Stefanik? Mr. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Good? Mr. Good votes yes. Ms. McLean?
Yes.
Ms. McLean votes yes. Ms. Miller?
Yes.
Ms. Miller votes yes. Ms. Steele? Ms. Steele votes yes. Mr. Estes?
Yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Ms. Latlow? Ms. Latlow votes yes. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes aye. Mr. Bean? Mr. Bean votes yeah. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes aye. Mr. Moran? Mr. Moran votes aye. Mr. James? Mr. James votes aye. Ms. Chavez-Dreamer? Chavez-Dreamer votes aye. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams votes yes. Ms. Houchin? Ms. Houchin votes yes. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes yes. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Savon? Mr. Savon? Mr. Savon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Saulnier? Mr. Saulnier votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Hayes? Ms. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes aye. Ms. Manning? Ms. Manning votes aye. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan votes aye. Mr. Bowman?
The clerk will report the tally.
Madam Chair, on this vote, there are 42 yeas and 0 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion's agreed to. H.R. 443 is ordered reported to the House of Representatives. The chair notes for the record that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice that all members have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, any members who wish to insert materials into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day today. If there is no further business before the committee, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.